I'm going to hand over to Doreen Berger to introduce our speaker. Doreen.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to everybody, including our newcomers. I'm going this afternoon to introduce you to Irina. She is a professional librarian. She worked in the Medway archives for almost 15 years. It was that work which inspired her to start researching Jewish history of the local community of Chatham and Rochester. The results, several articles on the subject, were published in Shemot, and she has had a recently published book with the title Foreigners, Citizens, Aliens, Medway and its Jewish Community. And this is a subject that Irina is going to speak to us about this afternoon. So welcome, Irina. Over to you, Irina.
Okay, I'm going to unmute myself.
Great.
Good afternoon, and well, thank you very much for coming to listen to the presentation. I have to say it's it's been a long haul trying to doing research for which resulted in a book, but let me start with sharing the screen first, and we fingers crossed it will be right. Yes, I'm screen sharing. That's lovely. Okay, so I presume you can all see the screen. Yes, the first slide.
Yes.
Looking good.
Okay, lovely. As I said, it's this presentation is based on the result of my findings for the book, and it deals exclusively with the narrow geographical area of Rochester and Chatham. There were other communities in Kent, and I mentioned them in the book, but only in relation to the Medway community. If there is no connection, I'm afraid, as every author has to do, unfortunately, cut out quite a lot in order to produce something which is easily readable and not get bogged down with all very interesting details and very interesting stories, but which unfortunately would not contribute to the main narrative of the book. Now, what I was interested in was not just the development and the history of the Jewish community per se. I was quite curious to explore the relationship between the Medway communities of Chatham, Gillingham, Rochester, the Medway towns, and the Jewish community. I also wanted to see whether the legislation, whether the national events or some international events, for example, various wars, military campaigns, whether they had any impact and how they influenced that relationship between the communities over the centuries. And of course, I explored the contribution of the Jewish community to the area as a whole. So there is a lot of it in the book, sort of various angles, various bits and bobs, various interesting narratives, including some personal stories. But because we only have about 45 minutes, I have to present a real whistle-stop tour and a very simplified tour of my findings. So just bear with me, okay? And any questions that you have, do feel free to ask in the end, okay? Well, the book starts from the pre-expulsion community, 12th and 13th century. We know that at the time, Canterbury was the main city in Kent with 262 households. It had a Jewish community of 100 people. We know there was a Jews Lane, and the site of the synagogue is known to us. In comparison, Rochester had only 16 households, despite the fact that it had, exactly as Canterbury, a castle, and a cathedral. However, there is absolutely no physical presence, no physical sign that Jews ever resided in Rochester. At the same time, there are various business records which survived, and they relate to Rochester. We can see that there are some Jewish names there. They involve Jews and some transactions with Jews. So there is somehow was Jewish presence in the city, but what it actually was, whether it was an organized Jewish community or not, it's still to be seen and to be explored by the researchers. Then, of course, in 1290, England becomes the first European country to expel its Jews. In 1342, oops, what's happening? Yeah. To expel its Jews. Well, despite the doubts of the existence of the organized Jewish community in Rochester, about 30 years after the expulsion, so in the 1320s, one of the monks of Rochester Priory finishes what is now known as the Rochester Chronicle. The manuscript is in the British Library. And we find there on the margins, we find this image, this illustration, depiction of the expulsion of the Jews. Well, it's obvious that they're Jews. You can see the tablets of the laws that they're wearing on the garments, and it's a pretty violent scene. A Christian threatening 3 Jews who were either residents or were passing through Rochester on their way back to the continent. It's still a mystery as to why, if there was no Jewish community in Rochester, why it was so important to depict it on the margins of the Rochester Chronicle. So it was depicted by a monk who resided in Rochester. Was still, whether we'll find the answer to this mystery, it's a good question, but that's what it is. And as far as I know, this is the only image that depicts the expulsion of Jews from England. Okay, so Jews got expelled. They were not present physically in the country anymore, but to say that they were not present would be rather wrong. It's just their presence got transformed into myths, stories, and images. In the city of Rochester celebrated the supremacy of Christianity and expulsion of its Jews in 1342, so about 20 years after the monk finishes writing Rochester Chronicle. In 1342, Bishop Haim of Hythe commissioned a new decorative door to the cathedral's chapter room. It's still there. That's what it looks like. You can see the image. You can see 2 female sculptures eclipsing the door frame. They represent the church and the synagogue. The figure of the church on the left-hand side, you can probably see that. It carries a staff in one hand and a model of a church in the other. The other figure on the right-hand side, blindfolded, is a beautiful woman wearing a mantle. It's the synagogue. She is poised, she's pathetic. She's holding her broken staff and the tables of the law with the rounded tops reversed. Now, this just a slight diversion, a very interesting story about this door, because, and this is a rare image which is prior to the 1890s. In 1825, there was a refurbishment of the cathedral. The architect at the time, either being ignorant about the symbolism of these 2 figures or deliberately ignoring the female figure of the church, he adorns it with the male head, with the bearded head of a bishop. And that's what you see here. If you can spot it, instead of the female head, it is a male head. The mistake was rectified only in the 1890s. So going back to the 14th and 15th centuries, the images of Jews, despite the fact that there were none in the country, also appeared in the literary works of well-known authors connected to Kent. Like Geoffrey Chaucer, we have his Prioress's Tale, part of his Canterbury Tales, written in between 1387 and 1400. There is a Canterbury playwright's Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, a play written in 1590, and of course the most famous or infamous, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, written around the same time in the 1590s. However, no expulsion is ever absolute. And when it was convenient, the royal family was happy to turn a blind eye to the presence of Jews in the country. Indeed, we know that already during the reign of Henry VII, sort of 15th century, there was a small Jewish community of cryptid Jews residing in England. After the readmission by the back door in 1656, and indeed it was a backdoor admission, Cromwell never explicitly permitted Jews to settle in this country due to a very strong anti-Jewish campaign. During that campaign, there were all sorts of accusations floating about. One of the probably most ludicrous from my point of view was the accusation that Jews were buying St. Paul's Cathedral in order to convert it into a synagogue. They had already made an offer of £500,000, and the only obstacle to the sale was that Parliament insisted on the purchase price of £800,000. So, as I said, there was no explicit permission for Jews to settle in the country. However, cunning and pragmatic, I suppose, Cromwell decided to turn a blind eye and do nothing as long if Jews did settle in the country, as long as they didn't make too much noise. And so the Jews, first Sfaradim and followed by Ashkenazim, started trickling into England. Of course, as we all know, they settled in London first. So what was happening? And that's where I'll go back to Rochester. So they were allowed to they started moving into the country in the 1650s, and already in the 1670s, in the Dean and Chapter Treasurer's books of Rochester Cathedral, we start finding Jewish names in the records relating to the alms given to people. So this is one of the earliest maps of Rochester. That's what the city looked like. So you can spot, okay, this is the River Medway with the vessels. This what today is current High Street. You can spot the castle and the cathedral. It approximately it looks exactly the same. The layout, it hasn't changed. Well, you can still spot the remnants of the wall, which at that time surrounded the whole of the city. So as I said, we can find some Jewish names relating to the records. How we know that Jews settled in the area and were not just passing by, because these books are absolutely full of names of people who traveled from A to B, passing through Rochester. There were people from America, there were people from Palestine, from Greece, from Turkey, Persia, all over the place. The difference that you spot is that there is a description. If there were travelers from A to B and only transitory visitors to Rochester, they were, it was described there. If there was no description, it implied, sometimes explicitly, sometimes it was implied, that those were people who settled there. And that's how we pull out the first Jewish names. But at the same time, Rochester acquired a rival, Chatham. And that's the one of the earliest engravings of the place, okay, of the town. Chatham was a small, very small village, just a tiny settlement with 200 residents in the 16th century, but within 100 years, by the end of the 17th century, it becomes a large town with over 2,000 population. And the major employer is the Royal Dockyard. Well, you can see some buildings there, sort of lots of ships and buildings of the dockyard. Some of them are still standing today. So the dockyard required workers, it required various suppliers. Well, bottom line, it provided opportunities to earn a living. It was a melting hot pot spot for people from all over the country, from people from abroad, and it was a place which potentially gave an opportunity to blend in with the population. Within 50 years, by the 1740s, we already find numerous Jewish entries in parish records, marriages and births. You may ask me why churches? Well, at the time, the marriages were considered legitimate if they were conducted according to the rites of Church of England. So to legitimize the marriages, to legitimize the births of the children, Jews simply utilized the local churches. And if the vicar was amenable, he would record both. And only in 1753, a Hardwick Marriage Act exempted Jews from conducting their marriages according to the Church of England rites. And that's where we start finding Jewish marriages recorded in the synagogues. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, by the 1740s, we already have a Jewish community, a small Jewish community residing in Chatham and Rochester. Additional confirmation of this community in the area we also find, not just in addition to the records, to the parish records, we find in the contemporary poems written by local poets. The earliest is 1756, and it describes Jews at the Strood Fair. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with the Medway towns, so it's a conurbation of several towns. We've got Strood, which is on the same side as Gravesend, on the same side as London, and then across the river, sorry, we've got Rochester and Chatham, plus later on Gillingham, Brompton, etc. So in 1756, we've got Jews selling some cheap jewelry at the Strood Fair. Well, that gives us a clue that most likely those were Ashkenazi Jews dealing with jewelry. And it was them who settled in the area. Another poem around the same time describes Chatham. It's written from the perspective of a respectable Church of England Englishman, and the poet doesn't hold back. Here drunken soldiers and ship crews, whores, Baptists, Methodists, and Jews swarm every part of Chatham. Okay, there were altogether about 8,000 Jews in the country, with the population at the time 5.5 to 6 million. But as we can see, there was no lack of anti-Jewish feeling. And it is reflected in the local poetry. There are many more, several more poems which I use in the book, with contemporary poems which describe the attitudes. But then something really strange happens in this area. Really remarkable, weird, puzzling. It went totally against the official position of the country towards its Jews. Well, first of all, a certain carpenter from Chatham, John Roberts, lets one of his dwellings for the synagogue. Okay, that was pretty common. Early Jewish community, they'll find a sympathetic Christian who would let some premises for the use as a synagogue. That was fine. But what was extremely unusual, the fact that he lets it long term. He lets the premises for 40 years. Typically, the leases granted to Jews were short term, similar to an annual lease in Plymouth. He does it for 40 years. Now let's have a look at the map. This is the only definitive record where the earliest synagogue of Chatham and Rochester was. It shows, well, you can spot, it says synagogue, okay, let me just show. Note the burial ground attached, despite the fact that it complies with the Jewish law. You can spot in the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, two letters I and G. It's basically, that tells you where the high street was and still is. It was so the place. So you've got the synagogue off the high street in the maze of various dwellings and shops and small premises. It's situated at a substantial distance from the city of Rochester and away from the direct view of the high street, chosen as if not to offend the hosts. The area of extreme end of Chatham High Street, on the border with Rochester, also had a notorious reputation. In the 1820s, it was known as the Khyber Pass. Narrow, dangerous, it was essential for getting from Chatham to Rochester and vice versa. The proximity to the river, and the river will be on the other side of this high street, so sort of beyond that high street. We can't see it here. The dockyard, the barracks, they ensured the existence of course, many drinking establishments, many pubs. And so the area would be frequently troubled by bouts of violence spilling over into the streets. But let's go back to the lease. So the lease was granted in the 1760s. Then about 20 years later, in 1788, Israel Levy, a practicing Jew, becomes the first freeman to trade in the city of Rochester. Well, let's remind ourselves that the first official freeman in the city of London was in 1831. So in Rochester, one became a freeman by service, by inheritance of birth, or by purchase, or by gift. Okay, Israel Levy paid £20 for the right to trade in the city. It was the same price as the price requested from a Christian wishing to obtain the privilege, and interestingly enough, it was in contrast with to the common practice in the country, where any sums requested from a Jew would be higher than those requested from a Christian. However, the most puzzling phenomenon was to do with the oath. The oath that Levy had to undertake in order to become a member of the corporation. As we know, until 1858, when all the disabilities relating to Jews in the country were lifted, admission to the city, or if a Jew wanted to take office, they demanded that the candidate swear an oath which contained the words "on true faith of a Christian." Now, I saw the original of the oath. The clause is nowhere to be seen. By 1807, there were 3 Jews trading in the city of Rochester. Then in 1832, following the Municipal Corporation Act, the city of Rochester modernizes the oath and removes the words "on true faith of a Christian" altogether. Just let's remind ourselves that the struggle for emancipation only started in 1829. And Rochester and Chatham continued their pioneering work of Jewish emancipation. In 1850, following the Municipal Act of 1845, which permitted Jews to be elected to municipal office, John Lewis Levy becomes the first Jewish magistrate in the country. In 1854, Chatham elects the country's first Jewish official, first Jewish High Constable, Charles Isaac. Well, High Constable basically is the same level, it's equivalent of mayor. The only difference is that High Constables were elected by court lead, which was more old-fashioned term of governing in comparison to the corporation. So Charles Isaac preceded the London's Mayor David Solomons, who so far have been considered to be the first official. The country at the time was involved in the Crimean War, and Queen Victoria visited the area 5 times in 1855. Charles Isaac hosted the Queen. It's really hard to underestimate the importance of that visit. He presents her with an address, she replies to him, and that's the country that still doesn't allow Jews to become members of parliament. So he is the first official and hosting the Queen. Interestingly enough, well, she obviously visits the area because of the hospitals, military hospitals, which were quite a few were around at the time. So she visits, one of them was Fort Pitt Hospital. The surgeon at the time in charge of the hospital was a Jew and an alien. So he wasn't even British, Dr. Jacob Solomon. Again, just a fascinating small fact. In 1856, Chatham elects another Jewish High Constable, John Montague Marks. In 1860, Rochester elects John Lewis Levy, the first magistrate in the country, is elected as Rochester's mayor. There are, of course, some stories about each one of them in the book. I simply don't have time to tell you all about them. Again, quite interesting to see it in comparison with other parts of the country, how the area differed and the attitude towards Jews differed for whatever reason. In 1862, Chatham elects its third Jewish High Constable, Daniel Barnard. Dan was the proprietor of the first, one of the first, if not the first, music hall in the country, and he was also an inventor of twice nightly system. Well, basically that, matinee performances and the evening performances. And he was a founder of the dynasty of music hall entrepreneurs. The area was visited quite a few times by the likes of Vesta Tilley, Dan Leno, Little Titch, Mary Lloyd, Charlie Chaplin, and Harry Houdini. And this is the contemporary view of Chatham from Fort Pitt Hill. So Fort Pitt Hospital is just behind us. This is a view which is recognizable. So again, if you happen to visit the area, you will see the same view. The houses are still there. So we are overlooking the river, the dockyard, which you can spot here, and the high street will be just behind these houses. At the time, in the 1830s, the area was home to over 30,000 people, excluding soldiers and sailors. We're lucky because we can find a description of the towns, and Jews, of course, in the works of the most popular author at the time, Charles Dickens. Dickens spent some of his childhood in Chatham and then returned to live on the outskirts of Rochester in Gad's Hill in March 1856. His first novel, The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, was published in 1837, and it features a description of Chatham and Rochester. Let me read it out. The principal productions of these towns, says Mr. Pickwick, appear to be soldiers, sailors, Jews, chalk, shrimps, officers, and dockyard men. The commodities chiefly exposed for sale in the public streets are marine stores, hardbake, apples, flatfish, and oysters. The streets present a lively and animated appearance, occasioned chiefly by the conviviality of the military. Okay, I think we're getting the drift. It's pretty rowdy. We know what they're selling. There are lots of people. It's very hustly bustly. But also what interested me in this description was the following. Soldiers, sailors, officers, dockyard men who come to the Medway towns from Wales, Scotland, every other corner of England, they're treated en masse. Their origin doesn't matter. They are defined by their occupation. By comparison, no matter what the occupation of a Jew is, he's first and foremost a Jew. In a similar vein, Jews are treated in Dickens's Mudfog Papers. It's a short work which followed the Pickwick Papers and was published the next year in 1838. The same happens in One Man in a Dockyard, published in 1851. The children of Israel were established in Chatham as salesmen, outfitters, tailors, old clothesmen, army and navy accoutrement makers, bill discounters, and general despoilers of the Christian world, in tribes rather than in families. At the time, Jewish community of the area was the fourth largest provincial community and consisted of only 189 people. That's in the population over 30,000, excluding sailors and soldiers. I find it hard to ignore Dickens's strong anti-Jewish attitude, which no doubt influenced opinions of quite a few people, and his subsequent denial in the 1860s of any Jewish anti-feeling, and his lame attempt to portray a positive Jewish character rear in Our Mutual Friend as the proof of it, to me somehow ring hollow. Community expanded, so it tried to integrate, as we say today. But the tragedy struck in January 1865. On Friday, 6th of January 1865, Lazarus Simon Magnus finished his business for a week, at his offices at 3 Adelaide Place near London Bridge. During the day, he developed a toothache. Well, it was a recurrent problem, but that day troubled him more than usual. He even complained about it to his brother-in-law, Manuel Costello. Manuel was the husband of Lazarus's younger sister, Lizzie. Manuel suggested that Lazarus came home with him to Sydenham, where Lizzie would cure it, but Lazarus refused. He didn't feel like traveling and thought he would stay for the Sabbath in the rooms next to his offices. At 10 p.m., he chatted to his housekeeper and asked her for the best remedy for the toothache. Well, she suggested the usual remedy at the time, laudanum on a piece of lint. But Lazarus suddenly thought of a better idea. He would try something new, a real novelty. He would try chloroform. He knew the precautions had to be taken. The anesthetic had to be carefully measured and administered whilst sitting. This way, when its effect took place, the arm would drop, stopping the inhalation. But the pain was becoming unbearable, and Lazarus decided to let chloroform flow freely on the sponge. Also, the pain might disappear quicker if he lay down. He was found lifeless the next morning by his housekeeper. He was only 39. Now, who was this Lazarus Magnus? He was quite an interesting character, and of course, quite a lot of it because he's such a significant character for the community. He was the son of a local businessman, but he also played a pivotal role in many projects. It was clear what an unusual and extremely bright personality he was. He was a successful businessman. He was a personal friend of Isambard Brunel. He was instrumental in reorganizing the Great Eastern Ship Company. Lazarus was also vice chair of Sittingbourne and Sheerness Railway Company and a driving force behind the building of the railway line connecting the Isle of Sheppey with the mainland Sittingbourne. So if you travel by train today between to the Isle of Sheppey, you have to change at Sittingbourne, and that's the legacy that he left to us all. He was a magistrate. He was elected mayor of Queenborough 3 times, first time in 1858. Again, he was one of the first Jewish officials in the country. He was the first commissioned officer in the country, the first commissioned Jewish officer in the country. In 1859, he was commissioned to form a corps of a territorial army. He was also instrumental in opening a new Sheerness synagogue in 1853 and was their deputy at the board. But most importantly, Lazarus Simon strongly believed that it was possible to be an Englishman and Jewish at the same time. He would fight inequality and bigotry whenever he saw it, irrespective of a person's rank, and that included Sir Moses Montefiore. At the stone-setting ceremony in 1866, Dr. David Wolfe Marks of the West London Synagogue suggested to the grieving father that it would be a good idea to build a permanent synagogue instead of that converted building, which was still in place. And the new synagogue would serve 2 purposes. Well, okay, I have to say that the converted property, which was let at the time, if you remember, by John Roberts, it was a wooden building, as many were at the time. So Dr. Marks suggested that the building of the permanent synagogue in the area would serve 2 purposes. First, it would symbolize that Jews settled in the area of the Medway towns on a permanent basis. And second, it would provide so much needed decorum to that part of the high street, to that Khyber Pass. And following that suggestion, in 1867, Simon Magnus, father of the deceased Lazarus, acquired a freehold of the synagogue building and the burial ground. London architectural firm of Hyman Henry Collins was involved. The builders were a local firm, Naylor and Son. The foundation stone was laid on the 5th of October, 1868. There are lovely descriptions in the local newspapers of what was happening. So of course it is in the book. The synagogue itself opened in May, and the consecration took place on the 17th of June, 1870. It was consecrated by the chief rabbi, Nathan Marcus Adler. The local newspapers wrote, an hour before the ceremony was due to start at noon, the high street opposite the new synagogue was thronged with the locals intent on witnessing the proceedings. Entrance to the synagogue was by ticket only, so great was the demand. Indeed, the papers say that there were 200 people crammed into the synagogue. Most of them were not Jews. And so the Jewish community had become an integral part of the Medway towns. This is the contemporary photograph of the synagogue. You can see the original is at the V&A. This is probably the only contemporary. There are two pictures of the same interior. Both are in V&A. And nearly 1 month after the ceremony, Rochester elected its first Jewish MP, Julian Goldsmith, and he went to represent Rochester for the next 10 years. So as I said, the Jewish community had become an integral part of this landscape, economic, social, and cultural. The reporters frequented the synagogue to learn about Jewish custom. The local clerics took the congregations to listen to the Jewish services and attended Jewish festivals. In 1882, when the situation for the Jews in the Russian Empire became dire and the congregation decided to hold a special service to raise funds, on the day the synagogue was besieged by a large crowd anxious to obtain admission. We're talking about the non-Jewish crowd. 2 policemen were keeping order. To avoid overcrowding, many were refused entry. However, the veneer of friendliness was thin and got pierced when immigration from the Russian Empire intensified. Anti-Semitism raised its head and permeated every layer of the society. It hugely increased during the First World War. Jews with their German-sounding names were perceived as spies, especially taking into account the military importance of the area. Yiddish was confused with German. The most revealing evidence of the atmosphere at the time was the declaration from the Jewish community, published in the local press in June 1915, following the sinking of Lusitania. The declaration stated, "There are no German Jews in this neighborhood." The members of the community kept their heads down, volunteered for the war effort, buried their dead, gave concerts trying to raise morale of the military and the navy, and tried again to blend in. After the war to end all wars ended, the battered and much diminished in numbers Chatham Jewish residents turned to rebuilding their lives. The horrors of the war were over, and the suspicions, malicious rumors circulating during the war had all been forgotten. the relationship between the communities was restored. But that peace was short-lived. The 1930s saw the rise of fascism, with the leader of the British Union of Fascists, Oswald Mosley, visiting the area several times. The presence of fascists was visible, though they did not win any parliamentary seats. They tried. Mosley and his party were a great source of concern for the Chatham Jewish community, which at that time consisted of only about 13 extended families. The new rabbi, Sam Wolf, was appointed in 1930. He devised a strategy. Education and engagement with the wider community was the key. Together with two London rabbis, the Reverend Rosenbaum from the Borough Synagogue and the Reverend Livingstone from the Golders Green Synagogue, and Harry Samuels, barrister and a member of the Fabian Society, Sam delivered lectures across Medway. As in Germany, Hitler's anti-Semitic propaganda and policies escalated, and Mosley and his party were gaining support from the public and press in the UK. Sam's topics, which started from the historic and religious perspectives on Judaism, became more and more political. The newspapers again found it fit to publish anti-Semitic diatribes, and though Sam Wolf's lectures attracted packed audiences and were always warmly received, it is rather telling that, as if to remind the audiences that Jews really did their bit during the Great War, he would mention that 50,000 served in His Majesty's forces, over 2,000 were killed, and 7,000 were wounded, as if to justify the worthiness of Jews, to evidence that, yes, they deserve to be treated as equal and be accepted. Wolf mentioned the name of Benjamin Disraeli, who served twice as Prime Minister, and Sir Isaac Isaacs, Governor General of Australia. Jews, he would say, had become British statesmen and administrators. British Jews, he would say, would be found among the men of eminence in art, science, medicine, law, and literature. On 15th of March 1939, Hitler tore up the peace of in our time Munich Agreement and invaded Czechoslovakia. Several days later, Mosley visited the Medway towns again, giving an hour-and-a-quarter speech at the Gillingham's Paget Hall. He concentrated on the developments in Europe, defended Hitler's actions, and ranted against Jews and refugees, accusing them of taking jobs of the 2 million British still unemployed. British rearmament was well underway, and the new war in Europe started to look imminent. And I'll stop at that. That's the end of the volume. So if you like what you've heard, if you want to read about stories, including personal stories, there are lots of personal stories, some sad, some interesting, some funny. The book is at the moment on Amazon. Any questions?
Irina, thank you. That was really very, very fascinating indeed. I want to mention that in your book, you give a lot of very important genealogical information. You've given the named Jewish records, the named Jews in the records of the Rochester Cathedral, early Jewish records from the Freemasons records, lists of the Jewish Navy agents of Chatham, and records from early directories. These are quite invaluable for the genealogists.
Yes, there are lots of records. At the end of the book, there are many tables and earlier records which give names there and all the details. And in addition to obviously all sorts of records and names in the book itself, in the text, because I just felt that it was really important for researchers and for the genealogists
Indeed, thank you very much, Irina, and thank you again for that wonderful talk. Would you answer some questions from our members?
Yes, of course.
So I'd like to throw it open now to our members. I'd like to mention that we're honoured with the members of the Magnus family with us today. So particularly if there's any questions from that family, we'd love to hear from them. And we have with us Diana da Costa from the Montefiore Heritage Group as well, who we're honoured to have with us. So I'd like to throw it open to any questions from our members, please. Anything anybody would like to ask?
Hazel Dacus has a question.
Thank you. I found your talk so interesting, Irina. Many thanks indeed.
Yeah.
I have a specific interest in a family that I've spent over 20 years researching, the Norden and Norton family. Now, John Norton, who is one of the very few Jewish settlers in 1820 at the Cape in South Africa, is said to have been a farmer from Kent. And I've never managed to find a record. He was born in 1794. He obviously left England in 1820. He did return and die here in 1848, but that was in London and a very brief visit before he died. So I'm interested in early community records where such names might be mentioned for the various occasions when they tend to be mentioned. So I suppose in this case it would be circumcision. His father was probably called Abraham. At least that's the name he gives when he marries. And he doesn't marry in England.
I haven't come across this name, but that means exactly nothing. So would you like to send me an email and I'll have a look what I can...
Thank you. What is your email address?
Okay, it is irina.fridman and at medway.gov.uk.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, I think Bernard has a question to ask. Bernard, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you for that fascinating talk. I was totally riveted. I think, like a lot of people who live in London, simply had not understood the importance and the significance historically of other places in our Jewish history and Jewish genealogy and the contribution of Jews to this country. While you were talking, I was looking up to see if I was related, as I always do, and find that I'm definitely related to Lazarus Simon Magnus. But I was intrigued by something in the search that I was doing for Daniel Barnard, and I wondered if you'd come across any connection, and that is an enormous number of Barnards in South Africa, who I think are related, including Christian Barnard, the first heart transplant surgeon. And I wondered if you knew whether or not he was a relative. But I'm definitely going to have to get your book because it looks as if it's got background to some of the stuff that I'm doing on my family. So thank you for presenting it to us.
You're welcome. As far as I remember off the top of my head, one of the Barnards, because Daniel had, if I'm not mistaken, he had 6 sons plus several daughters, and one of them left for South Africa. So there definitely should be a connection.
Thanks.
And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll see what I can find.
Thank you.
Irina, I noticed that by 1820, most of the Jewish community, particularly in Chatham, were English born.
Yes, which says quite a lot that they settled very early in that area. But again, it's logical. It's a close proximity to London. It's a close proximity to the continent. It's got the river, so it's easy to trade, and it's got the dockyard, which again allows to earn a living.
Yes.
So it's sort of, it's such a, geographically, it's a very logical place to settle.
Yes.
And it's cheap.
Yes, yes. So it's quite an interesting insight into, as Bernard says, the communities outside London. Are there any more questions for Irina? Bernard, you have another question?
If you don't mind my asking a second one, you've talked about the advantage of location. And I noticed that my connections to the Lazarus family are largely through my Dutch family. And I wondered whether or not there was a significant history of Dutch settlement in the area.
I haven't seen precisely, there's simply nothing there, no records available. So I cannot confirm whether there is a Dutch, but it's logical. I know that Magnus, and I give the story of the Magnus family there. They come via Amsterdam there, via, no, sorry, not Amsterdam, I'm talking nonsense, via Zwolle, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Peter, I believe you have a question.
Yes, hi there. Thank you. I just wondered, I know I did some research for a colleague about the Isle of Sheppey's Jewish community in the 19th century. And I wondered whether the Rochester, I think was the nearest probably Jewish community to Sheppey, whether there was any connection, whether they shared any common, yes, I don't know, religious things or whatever.
Yeah, there were very strong connections between them, simply because the two communities connected to the dockyards. And Lazarus was a member of both communities, Chatham community and Sheerness community. There hasn't been, there's very little research has been done about the Sheerness community, simply because, well, there was no researcher who would undertake that. There is one, I think only one article which is available in the Kentish, in Bygone Kent, which talks, quite an old article, which talks about that community, and the maximum is related to Lazarus Magnus, of course.
When I was researching it, I discovered, I can't remember the name now, I'd have to look it up, but in the 1820s, a Jewish composer, and obviously with a naval bent, wrote the famous A Life on the Ocean Waves.
Are we talking Henry Russell?
Yes, yes, the Russells.
Yes.
The Russells are a well-known family, apparently, well-known family in 19th century Sheppey.
Yes.
Yes, I mentioned him quite a bit, and it's funny because the funniest thing was, I can't remember the exact story at the time, but there's some obviously anti-Semitic far-right movement, and they try to instill some nationalist views, etc., etc. They ask the crowd to sing a song, oblivious to the fact that it was written by Henry Russell, by a Jew. So that was just, I found it rather amusing, if it's the right word. Yes, but he's, I mentioned him, and I do mention, again, because of the relation, because of the dockyards, so there will be something in the book quite a bit.
Okay, if I can just mention that I'm a descendant of Henry Russell and the Russell family from Sheerness.
Oh, so, nice to meet you.
Yeah, that's all I can say at this moment in time.
Thanks, Adrian. Doreen, I don't know if you've seen, but I think it's Sue Wolfe in the JGSGB library who wants to ask a question. Sue?
Well, it's more to make a point. I'm a descendant of the Chatham Barnards. They originally came from Canterbury,
Yes,
And
they
they
did.
changed their name from Siegel to Barnard,
Yes.
probably in the 1790s.
Yeah.
As far as I know, although I had other relatives in South Africa, none of my Barnard family actually went to South Africa. Some went to Australia, quite a lot went to the States, but the majority stayed in England. And I occasionally see descendants of some of the Rochester Barnards. They're still very active in the Jewish community.
Well, I was in touch with some of them. There is obviously a story about the Barnards, and because yes, when they moved to Chatham from Canterbury, two brothers, if I'm not mistaken, Berman and Sam, they moved after the death of their father in Canterbury. So I do give all these details in the book. I have much more material about Barnards, obviously, from the newspapers, which didn't make it into the book simply because
exactly. And there is so much. I keep finding more and more, but I can only go back to about the early 1780s with them in England.
As far as I remember, they came. The story went that they came from Bohemia.
That's the story, because they had a surname.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I don't know, various relatives have researched in Bohemia, and it's not known if they found anything.
Right.
Thank you, Sue. That's really fascinating. Are there any more questions?
I think Michael Cooper has a question.
Michael?
Hello. Yes. In response to something that Bernard said, you said you've not come across any Dutch people. Well, my interest in Chatham came about that I was looking at my ancestry, and I found that back in the 19th century, my family had married people called Van Cleef, but it could be Van Cleef. It got anglicized into Van Cliff. And I wonder if that could partly be the reason, anglicization of names, that has obscured the possibility of any Dutch people being found in Chatham.
It is a possibility. Well, as we all know, to research Jewish ancestry with changing names, with anglicizing names, with moving, using Hebrew names for the synagogue, and then using non-Hebrew names, English names, for the outside world, which have no connection, is sometimes a nightmare. And by the way, talking about going back to Barnard's, Berman and Sam lived nearby. Berman had the first son, his name was Daniel, and then Sam got the first son, whose name was Daniel. So the gap between them is about 3-4 years. They live next to each other. They do approximately the same jobs, so to speak, the same occupation, try to decipher who is who, and trying to find the right one so that not to get confused. Sometimes it's a nightmare.
So presumably they had a grandfather probably who was called Daniel.
Yes. It's just when you have the same generation with two names and they're close and nearby.
Are there any more questions, please, for Irina?
Hazel has another one.
Hazel?
Just unmute.
Oh, you've gone back on mute, Hazel.
That's it. Irina, going back to records, can you tell me the dates for which there are synagogue records for the area?
Oh, okay. The earliest which are not transcribed are going back to the 1790s. They are in Yiddish, Hebrew, and they need to be transcribed, to be truthful, by, I think, if I'm not mistaken, by 1815, they switched to English.
And do they cover marriages and deaths, or what?
No, well, most of them, I suspect, from what I've seen, married in the Great Synagogue. So they didn't marry in the synagogue per se. First of all, there was no official rabbi till, oh God, I need to remember exactly the dates.
Phillips, I think. Jehiel Phillips was the first rabbi, I believe.
No. They were before. They were before him. He's the most famous one as the first rabbi of the new synagogue. He became the rabbi in 1854, if I'm not mistaken. Prior to that Jehiel Phillips. I'm talking nonsense. Sorry, I'm confusing him with Pollack. Jehiel Phillips was preceded Pollack. He started, I think, in 1830s. If you give me a second, I'll tell you exactly, because I'll just take a copy of the book.
The first marriage, the first marriage in the synagogue was actually with his daughter Jane.
Yes, that's what I put there. Yes, but that we're going only to the mid 19th century.
Sure.
So prior to that, most of them would be in the Great Synagogue, and sort of if you look at synagogue scribes, that would be the major. And some of them didn't bother getting married at all.
So what are these records from the 1790s then?
Okay, it's the ledger book. It's in the archives, in the Medway archives.
Right.
There are 2 ledger books, and as I said, the earliest one is 1795, if I'm not mistaken.
And you said that they mentioned that they were actually in Hebrew.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Is there anything else we can ask Irina?
I know that the translation, there is a transcription of the second ledger, which was done by Michael Jollis some years ago.
All right. Okay.
It's one of ours, yeah.
Yes, so it is available. I know that it is available.
Where is it available?
Well, again, it will be in the archives.
Your archives.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess you can contact Michael Jollis through the society as well.
Thank you, Irina. With that, I'd like to close this part of the meeting. Thank you so much, Irina. And can we give Irina a nice round of applause, please?
Thank you.
Irina, I'd love you to stay if you could stay, possibly. If you'd like to stay, we'd be welcome to. So we're going to have a very short break, say 15 minutes for a cup of tea, and then we'll come back and we'll go on to our members' questions and successes and what they want to tell us. So I'll see you soon.
Doreen, just before we break, if I may, for those who haven't visited the new JGSGB library, you can actually see what it's like in the window marked Martin Hill. Contrary to popular belief, it's not actually in the jungle, but it is at the Jewish Museum London. And I think we can see Anita, and we saw Sue Wolf and Lydia and Martin wandering around, but please do feel free to visit it when it's open, but remember to email library@jgsgb.org.uk before you go, because due to COVID restrictions, we have to limit numbers. But with that, I think we can go to the break.
Thank you. See you soon.